Our first speaker will be Dr. Lubchenko.
Thank you very much indeed. Hello, everyone. Lovejoy-san, Watson-san, and I offer our collective thanks to the Asahi Glass Foundation for the opportunity to help celebrate the 25th anniversary of the Blue Planet Prize. We're here today to offer our perspectives on the current state of the environment, including the progress that has been made and challenges remaining. We appreciate very much your joining us here today. My colleagues and I have prepared a joint statement that integrates our individual perspectives. I believe that you have that in front of you. It was available on the way in. For this press conference, each of us will offer some specific thoughts on one of three complementary areas. I will begin by a focus on oceans. Dr. Lovejoy will continue with a focus on biodiversity on land, and Dr. Watson will focus on climate change and the policy implications of all of those. It is fitting that we begin with a focus on the ocean, for indeed, the Earth is an ocean planet. All of Earth ultimately depends on the ocean. People have used the ocean since time immemorial, but only recently have our impacts resulted in global depletion and disruption of ocean ecosystems. The future of the health of the ocean is at risk, and therefore, our own health, prosperity, and well-being are also at risk. The planet and we are at risk because of climate change, ocean acidification, overfishing, and habitat destruction. What, might you ask, is really at stake? The answer I would give is the myriad benefits that we want and need from the ocean. These include healthy and delicious seafood, half of the oxygen we breathe, every other breath you take, was generated by plants in the ocean. Medicines, climate regulation, control of pests and pathogens. Other benefits include the opportunities for recreation and inspiration and other very important cultural and spiritual values. In short, people depend upon a healthy ocean, but our actions have inadvertently threatened it. We understand that now. Make no mistake, the situation is dire, but it is not hopeless. Around the world, people are finding solutions that enable us to use the ocean without using it up. We have learned the secrets to ending overfishing and recovering depleted species. We are learning the key role that fully protected marine reserves, also called marine parks, marine protected areas, the role that they have in protecting biodiversity, recovering depleted species, and enhancing resilience to climate change. We know that these and other solutions exist. They're bubbling up all around the world. The problem is that those solutions are not being used at the scale that we need to fix the problems that we have. The reality is that it's hard to reform fisheries. It's hard to create large and many protected areas. I would say, yes, it is hard, but it can be done. And it can be done with great success. We have proof of this. Courageous leaders in the fishing industry, in coastal communities, in governments, in civil society, are working with each other and with scientists to develop and use new solutions. And those solutions are working. In the United States, for example, when I was at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, we undertook a very painful process of reforming our fisheries. The result was that we slashed overfishing by 60%, 60%, and then recovered a large number of species that had been depleted. Recovery of those species is now allowing sustainable fishing at a much higher level than when the stocks were depleted. We have increased the number of jobs supported by fisheries by 35% since 2008. We have increased the amount of fish caught domestically by 23% and the value by 32%. In summary, the result was a win-win-win. Benefits to coastal communities and seafood lovers, benefits to the economy, and benefits to the environment. Similar reforms are underway in the EU and in many other nations. We've learned from these experiments in many different places what some of the keys to successful fishery reform look like. Number one, involvement of fishermen. Number two, good science. Number three, changing the economic and social incentives to enable fishermen to be good stewards of the resource and the environment, and not to fish so hard today that there's nothing left for tomorrow. This approach of changing incentives is spreading. The environmental organization, EDF, who is working with fishermen, managers, government officials, and scientists in many countries, report that these rights-based approaches to fisheries that have been so successful in aligning short-term and long-term incentives is now being used for over 200 fisheries involving 500 species in more than 40 countries. Despite that progress, there is still massive overfishing globally, so there's still a lot more to be done. The point is that we have the tools, we just need to use them. Recent models of fisheries around the world suggest that it is possible to recover most depleted species within 10 years, and that the benefits of doing so outweigh the costs 10 to 1. If all global fisheries were recovered, the outcome would be a 90% increase in profits, 1/3% more fish in the ocean, and a 10% increase in harvests. So there is room for hope on the fisheries and food security front. Turning briefly to my second example of solutions that need to be replicated and scaled up, marine reserves. These are fully protected areas of the ocean where no extractive or destructive activities are allowed. The ocean is rich with amazing biodiversity. Until recently, most of the ocean was inaccessible. And so most of the ocean was a de facto marine reserve. We did not do any extraction from it. In the last century, however, technology has enabled us to fish, drill, and mine virtually everywhere in the ocean. As a consequence, we are losing biodiversity and destroying habitats everywhere and disrupting ocean ecosystems. Marine reserves are an excellent tool to help restore the balance. They are a powerful solution. We know that creating marine reserves protects habitat and biodiversity. We know that marine reserves can help replenish depleted fisheries, and we know from recent studies that marine reserves can also enhance resilience to climate change. At present, only between 2 and 3% of the entire ocean is fully protected in marine reserves. The governments of the world have agreed to a target of 10%. Scientists tell us we probably need more on the order of 30%, but we are not on track to achieve even the 10% by 2020. The good news is that momentum is growing for creation of more and larger marine reserves. A decade ago, less than 0.1% of the ocean was fully protected, 0.1%. So in a short time, just a decade, we now have between 2 and 3%, so that's over an order of magnitude increase. A number of countries have taken courageous action to create these blue parks in their own exclusive economic zones surrounding their countries. The U.S. has increased the area that is fully protected of its EEZ by over fourfold, from 5% to 23% between 2009 and 2015. A number of other countries have increased their percentages as well. The little tiny Pacific nation of Kiribati protects 80% of its EEZ. Chile 23, Gabon 26, for example. Most of these blue parks are in the EEZs of countries. There's also one large, very large marine reserve in the high seas, the Ross Sea MPA in the Southern Ocean, that was approved by 25 different governments, including Japan. So momentum is increasing, and we are seeing strong evidence of the multiple benefits. These are two very powerful solutions that I've mentioned, fishery reform and marine reserves. Neither is a panacea, but they are proven ways to use the ocean without using it up. The opportunity is to learn from these solutions, to replicate them, to create other solutions, and to scale them up. Doing so will help return the ocean to a healthy state and bring multiple benefits to people, to communities, to economies for years and years to come. It's time that we move on with using these solutions and returning the ocean to a healthy state. Thank you.
Dr. Lovejoy?
So my lens is through terrestrial biodiversity on the global environment. And biological diversity is simply a way to refer to the collective variety of life on Earth. Think of it most simply as the total numbers of species in a forest or on the entire planet. But it's much more than just a list of species doing individual things. Together, they make up ecosystems, and ecosystems in turn provide all kinds of benefits for us, whether it's soil biodiversity, nurturing agriculture, or whatever other benefit one might care to look at. At the largest scale, this planet actually works not as a physical system, but as a linked biological and physical system. And the great global carbon cycle, badly distorted by climate change, is being contributed to not just by the destruction of ancient ecosystems, which we call fossil fuels, but also by the destruction and degradation of modern-day ecosystems. If you look at the rate of species loss, it is accelerating, which means that collectively we've not got the problem in hand as yet. And we're also looking ahead in the next 10 or 20 years to probably the last opportunities to protect natural areas that aren't already in the protected area estate. Part of that, I think, will include restoration of ecosystems, because there's just an amazing amount of degraded land on the planet. And restoring those degraded lands will actually take some CO2 back out of the atmosphere. Looking ahead, we have 2, maybe 3 billion more people who will be arriving on this planet. We'll have to feed them. That means competition for land for various purposes. But actually, ecological scientists have looked at that challenge and determined we can actually feed all those people an adequate and healthy diet without destroying another square inch of nature. That's simple to state. It's tough to actually make that happen, but it's time to really get started on it. So I would just highlight that safeguarding biological diversity is particularly difficult because biological diversity essentially integrates all environmental problems. They all affect the living systems. So in the end, as a shorthand for the state of the entire planet, look at how much biological diversity survives. Biodiversity is still poorly explored. That means sometimes it's really hard to explain to people why it's important. But let me just give you a couple examples. Most of the molecules the molecular biologists use to do gene editing and things like that all come from living organisms. And most molecular biologists don't even realize that. So we need to think about biological diversity as an immense living library that we need and should husband in order to grow the life sciences to human benefit. And you know, I get these most interesting things out of the Wall Street Journal, right? As opposed to a scientific journal. So there is an organism called a slug. And a slug is basically a snail without a shell. And you probably all had battles with them in your gardens. Well, somebody has found a slug that has an adhesive that works even in wet conditions. And it's already being put to use in open heart surgery. So there are all kinds of adaptations and solutions out there in nature which can be part of helping us attain a sustainable future. And there are tons of solutions. I won't go into them now, but one of the key set of solutions are all around sustainable cities that protects more of the land for nature, puts less demand on biological systems. Thank you very much.
Our final speaker is Dr. Watson.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. There's absolutely no doubt that we humans are changing the climate system. It's already 1 degree warmer than it was in pre-industrial times. We're seeing changes not only in temperature, but precipitation patterns throughout the world. The dry areas are getting drier. The wet areas are getting wetter. Sea level is increasing. We're seeing more extreme weather events, more floods, more droughts, more high wind events. These changes in climate are caused by us using fossil fuels to produce energy and by deforestation, primarily in the tropics. By changing the Earth's climate, we are threatening food security, water security, human health. We're also finding that climate change is having adverse effects on biodiversity, both in the oceans that Jane talked about and on land that Tom talked about. So the issue of climate change and biodiversity have to be looked at together. You cannot look at them in isolation. We should applaud the governments of the world that they met a couple of years ago in Paris, and they agreed that we should limit changes in the Earth's climate to no more than 2 degrees Celsius relative to pre-industrial, with an aspirational target of 1.5 degrees Celsius. The governments of the world should be applauded for this. This means we need to go to a low-carbon economy. We need to produce our energy without using fossil fuels, wind, solar, hydropower. We need to use our energy more efficiently, more efficient cars, more efficient buildings, more efficient infrastructure in general. Unfortunately, the Paris Agreement will not meet the Paris targets of 2 degrees Celsius. Indeed, the pledges made in Paris are a major step in the right direction, but if we only implement those steps, we would still have a world that will become 3 to 4 degrees warmer. We'll pass the aspirational target of 1.5 by 2030 to maybe 2035 if we're lucky, and we'll pass the 2 degree target by 2050 to 2060. So yes, government should be applauded, but we have to do much, much more if we're going to reach the targets set in Paris. Now, the problem is the governments have also done 2 other wonderful things. They agreed 20 so-called Aichi targets here in Japan, when the Convention on Biological Diversity met. 20 very different targets of different elements of biodiversity. They also did a brilliant job, governments, in my opinion, of agreeing 17 UN Sustainable Development Goals. They range from issues such as poverty, eliminate poverty by 2030, food security for everyone in the world, water security for everybody in the world. Health issues need to be dealt with, both communicable diseases and non-communicable diseases. We need to sustainably produce goods and sustainably use them. We have to deal with gender issues, educational issues, and security issues, personal security, all the way up to global security. And indeed, the government should be applauded for the Paris Agreement, the Aichi targets, and the Sustainable Development Goals. But unfortunately, we are not on track to meet the Paris Agreement of 2 degrees Celsius. We are not on track to meet any of the Aichi targets. Progress in the right direction, but not enough progress. And the problem is, by not meeting the climate targets and not meeting the biodiversity, we will undermine any chance of the Sustainable Development Goals. Climate change and loss of biodiversity will undermine our efforts to alleviate poverty. They will undermine food security, undermine water security, undermine human health, undermine generally security issues. And so the challenge we have is we have to recognize that climate change and biodiversity, yes, are environmental issues, but much more important, they're development issues. We, the human race, need to address climate change, need to address the loss of biodiversity, if indeed we want food, water, energy security, if we want to get rid of many of the diseases that are afflicting us. So governments around the world need to work with the private sector. The private sector is extremely important to work together with, and civil society generally. Each of us as individuals can make certain choices in our lives not to waste energy, not to destroy biodiversity. So we need behavioral change, we need better policies and better use of technologies. And I agree with Jane, if we all work together, we can solve the problem, but we need to do much, much more. And the time for action is now, not tomorrow. Thank you.
We'll now open up the discussion with questions and answers. Anyone? Raise your hand and let